Okay, so a warm welcome to one and all attending the 80th CSR Foundation Day event held at NCL. We are honored today to have amongst us Professor Raghu Rangaswamy from IIT Chennai, who has graciously accepted our invitation as the key speaker of the event. I'd like to welcome our director, Dr. Ashish Lele, my colleagues from MCL and other CSR laboratories, and the students. I'll now request our director, Dr. Ashish Lele, to share his thoughts.
Thank you, Sarika, and welcome Raghu for this event. We thank you again formally to have accepted our last minute invitation and come here. And the topic that you have is certainly of great interest to all of us. Turns out, Raghu, that the Foundation Day main lecture at CSIR was also given by Professor Vidyasagar. And he also talked, of course, about artificial intelligence, neural networks, machine learning, and it's a wonderful talk that he gave. So this is just reinforcing, your talk is going to reinforce that train of thought. Before I let Sarika or Anu introduce you formally, Raghu, I just want to quickly tell you a little bit about CSR Foundation Day. Essentially, if you look back at the history, it's a very interesting history through which CSR was created. You probably might know about it, but for the benefit of others, very quickly summary of that is just before the Second World War, India had only what was called the Bureau of Scientific Research. There were a few educational institutes like the ISCS and the ISC and the Bose Institute and so on, a few other colleges of repute, but nothing really that was dedicated to industrial research, right? And it was in 1939 when the war was really growing. The government, as usual, reduced funding for any scientific research, whatever minuscule funding was there at that point of time. And the note appeared on the desk of Sir Arcot Ramaswamy Mudaliar, okay, who was the Commerce Minister of the government at that time. And I wish we had more such bureaucrats in the government. He basically said that yes, we should abolish the Bureau of Scientific Research, but instead of that, we should create the Board of Scientific and Industrial Research with vaster resources and wider funding and bigger objectives. So, that was quite amazing to come from there. And of course, it was then also supported by Jawaharlal Nehru, who at that time was heading the National Planning Committee, which was set up by none other than Subhash Chandra Bose, and at the behest of none other than Meghnad Saha. So you can see how, the men and the hour met. And in 1940, the government acceded to the proposal of Sir Mudaliar and set up what is called the Board of Scientific and Industrial Research. Okay. And in 1941, just following a few months after the board was set up, the then Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, he approached Sir Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, right? And who was at the Punjab University at that time, and asked him to take up the post of scientific advisor and director of the BSIR, right? At that time, BSIR. And he was not very sure. Sir Bhatnagar was not sure exactly whether he should. And then again, once again, this big man, Sir Mudaliar, came to the rescue. He went and convinced Sir Bhatnagar to take up that responsibility. And the rest is, as they say, history. He took over the reins, and he, at that time, he says that while I was taking up the offer, he was already thinking about a chain of laboratories to be set up across the country, which would focus on both scientific and industrial research. So that's how BSIR was born. And one last stroke of genius from Sir Mudaliar. Again, I don't know what we would have done without this person. He decided that BSIR was fully controlled by the government, which is not very healthy. And so he created an autonomous body, which is now what is CSIR, so Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and kept Sir Bhatnagar as the first Director General of CSIR. So it's an amazing history of how that all got created. And for the last 80 years, since 1942, CSIR has made enormous contributions, right from nation building in the formative years to meeting challenges of the technology denial era, supporting self-reliance, which today is famously called Atmanirbharta. We were doing it then, we are trying to do it now, and also reach now to bring India, at a leadership level in technology. So, enormous contributions from CSIR over the past 30 years. May I request people to turn their microphones off?
मेरा ही H category में तो मेरे ही पोस्टर का नंबर 152 था.
Nikhilesh, can you control the microphones, please?
Yeah, I'm trying to do it.
Thank you. So, we at NCL have been very proud to be part of the CSIR family. And we as a lab have also contributed immensely to CSIR. More of that on our Foundation Day.
No, Ashish, you are muted. Ashish, you are muted. I think Nikhilesh.
Okay, sorry, Nikhilesh muted me.
Yes, instead of
Since you asked others to be muted.
No, sir, I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
Nikhilesh, you should mute others than me.
No, I didn't do it. Somebody.
I think he's trying to tell me that I'm taking up a lot of time. Welcome, Ashwini. Good to see you again. Good to see you. And I hope other
morning, Ashish
directors
and everyone.
Also...
Good morning. Yeah, thank you.
Morning, morning. So with that very short introduction, Raghu, to CSIR, I'm now going to ask Sarika or Anu to give a formal introduction to the speaker today. Over to you, Sarika or Anu.
I would request Anu, Dr. Anu Raghunathan, to introduce the speaker and also moderate the question answer session after the talk. Anu, over to you.
Nikhilesh, don't mute Anu. Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me over here?
Yes. Yeah.
You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, Anu, we can hear you.
All right, because I think I'm having a little bit of a network issue out here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Raghunathan Rangaswamy, more popularly known as Raghu, for this Foundation Day lecture today. He is the Marty Manaria Gurunath Institute Chair Professor, the Dean of Global Engagement, and a core member of the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and AI at IIT Madras. He incidentally also has a BTech degree from IIT Madras and a PhD from Purdue. He's the co-founder and director of 3 IITM incubated companies, Gyan Data Private Limited in data analytics, Geeta with an extra A, Private Limited, a data science training company, and Elicious Energy, developing novel hydrogen PM fuel cells company. Prior to this, working at IIT Madras, he worked for several years as a faculty in the US and also at IIT Bombay. Raghu's work is essentially in systems engineering with a focus on modeling and the use of data science, specifically machine learning and AI techniques. He also approaches problem in energy systems, systems biology, and droplet microfluidics using these systems principles. I'm not going to read out all his accomplishments. They are a lot. They would probably fill in a lot of time. So I'm just going to state a few of his key works. His work has resulted in more than 135 papers with 2 US patents and several conference papers and presentations. He is very interested in pedagogy. So he has an undergraduate process control book, which he has co-authored, incorporating some of the latest ideas in the field and which was published last year and is called the Data Science for Engineers. He consults for many companies in India and abroad on data science projects. He was honored, as I mentioned, he is interested in pedagogy, and so he was honored with the Omega Chi Epsilon Professor of the Year Award in Clarkson way back in 2003, and the YBG Verma Award for Teaching Excellence at IIT Madras in 2018. He also has several courses, MOOC courses, that more than 1 lakh students have attended, both in data science as well as in programming. He has participated in several committees. He's a part of the DST committees, the DBT committees. He's a member of the Research Council at the Naval Materials Research Laboratory as well, and also the DRDO. He's an advisor to the Confederation of Indian Industry for their AI Center of Excellence. He was recently elected as a fellow to the Indian National Academy of Engineering in 2017. So as you can see, Raghu is one of the pioneers of applying artificial intelligence to science and engineering. He also believes in perseverance to be one of the most important attributes for researchers. On the flip side, he also plays the flute and believes that one has to go over the noise regime to tune in and bring in the higher signal to noise ratios. The Foundation Day lecture today will be on AI in science and engineering, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts and insights. Raghu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu. It just shows that the perseverance works in many ways. So the number of things you can say about someone is directly dependent on how gray their hair is and how long you've been doing this. So I'm really thankful for your wonderful introduction. And let me start my lecture. And I titled this AI in Science and Engineering because this seems most relevant now. And the way I structured this lecture, and I'll go more into this, I didn't want to ask Anu. I always find it very hard to ask this question: how much of your audience would know a lot about machine learning and AI? I kind of made the judgment that for many people, this might be one of the first times they are hearing lots of this. So I have a portion of this talk which is very basic, very engineering view of understanding all this. If you might want to call it a little bit of a mumbo jumbo also is there in all of this. So how to understand all of that. And then later, I think I want to talk about what chemical engineers can do, what AI work we do in our lab. And then the next segment is really to see where this thing is going. I really think that this is an exciting field. And this is not the preserve of computer science. And I think chemical engineers and chemists and everyone can use this. So I'm going to tell you all the really exciting stuff that's going on. And then finally, you know, to Ashish's point, I think we need more Mudaliars now to really take our country forward in this field. So I'll just give you some ideas about what we should do. Incidentally, I think if I'm not mistaken, Arkat Ramachandran, who is son of Mudaliar, was one of the directors at IIT Madras. And his son was also a faculty member in the Department of Arkat Ramachandran's son was a faculty member in the Department of Chemical Engineering. Just a connection there. Okay, so let me share my, we did check this works before. So let me make sure. Okay. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay, so this now should show up. Windows. Yeah. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, so the title of the talk today is AI in Science and Engineering. I asked Anu, I have about an hour. Is that correct? Or is it too long?
Yes.
It's
no,
okay.
No, we have
okay.
an hour.
Okay, so so let me start by saying AI is for everyone, and I'm going to start this by my own example. So when I reached Purdue after a bachelor's in chemical engineering at IIT Madras, I worked with someone who was already working in AI, it was Venkat, in the field of chemical engineering. So the very first research problem that I got was the following, and you can see this question, which is if you have process data and you have quantitative data about the process through sensors, is there a way in which you can come up with a natural language description of this? And this you should do for any kind of data without much handholding. Okay, so this is the very first problem that I got to look at, which is to look at noisy process data and then see whether you can come up with natural language description for this. Now, you can think of this as some version of natural language processing that we talk about now. For example, you can speak in Hindi and then get translated to English and so on. Similarly, if you had data, can you translate this to actual language? So the way we solve this problem is the following. So we said you can break this data into what we called as primitives, which are basic structures that underlie data like this, identify primitives from the data using neural networks, and then you would get a sequence of string like this, and then from the string you can come up with natural language descriptions of this process and so on. And in the meanwhile, you will make some errors and so on, and you can do context-free and context-dependent error correction to do this. So the reason why I'm saying this is because first thing I want to the first message, if I will, is that AI is for everyone. It's not a computer science alone field. It is for engineers, and chemical engineers have been working in this for a very, very long time. In fact, it turns out my very first paper in my research career was 95 in this journal called Engineering Applications of Artificial Intelligence, and where we talked about how you can think about this process data and then look at it as a syntactic pattern recognition problem and solve this problem. So that's the first message. So all of us, I think we should be thinking about these techniques, because as I'll show later in this lecture, it's going to have a tremendous impact in the way science and engineering is done. Okay, now the second message I want to give is AI is everywhere. So don't think I'm a megalomaniac wanting to put my picture here. I just want to tell you what happened with this talk itself. So Anu asked me for an abstract and a picture for the poster and so on. So I sent her a picture. Either that picture was not high resolution enough or was not appropriate enough. I finally saw this poster, which is from the web, right? So with this picture, this was not the picture I sent. So interestingly, I thought let's do some AI on ourselves. So to show AI is everywhere. So this is the picture I sent before. So the picture on the left to the picture on the right is after 10 years and half a deanship. So you can see aging. So I just wanted to see what would AI technique think about how I will look 10 years from the time the first picture was taken. The first picture was taken in about 2011. And if I show you this very unflattering image, my wife was very actually upset that I was going to put up this image. I said, don't worry, it's okay. But this is how AI thinks I look 10 years from there. Now, there are some interesting things about this I just wanted to point out. Number one is this was an AI tool. It took me just maybe 1 minute to do this. So that's how pervasive AI has become in our everyday life. The other point that I want to make from this exercise itself is actually when I look at this image and I say, do I look like this? Hopefully not. But there are certain features which the AI has actually captured remarkably well. For example, the graying of hair and the thinning of hair actually is quite nicely captured by AI. However, the skin, the way the skin looks and so on is not as well captured. So the point that I'm trying to make here is AI is everywhere. It's very easy to use nowadays and not really need to worry about many of these things. And the other thing that is important is there are things that AI does very well and there are things that AI does not do as well. So just jumping in and then saying AI will solve all the problems, maybe many years down the line. But currently, we have to think about all of this when we think about AI. OK, so as I said in my introductory remarks, I was thinking about this flow of this talk. Then I decided that I will spend some time, at least assuming a lot of this audience wouldn't have worked with ML and AI systems, to really demystify in some sense what this is all about. And the way I do this, there are two ways of doing this. There is a very philosophical way of demystifying these things, and there is a more engineering, mathematically grounded way of demystifying this. And I'm going to take the second approach because as engineers, we want systems that we can use. And then I'll transition to work that we do in our lab, both research work that I do in my lab and also the industrial projects that we have done, to give you a flavor for how we could use some of these techniques in industrial problems. And the third bit is where I think I'm going to look at the literature in the world and then look at how people are thinking about AI. And you would find this really remarkable, the number of things that people are thinking about doing. And that will flow into how we cannot be left behind in India and how we really need to pull up our socks and then be a partner in this change. We might have our misgivings about AI. we might think there's a lot of words that are thrown at us, terminology and so on, but still fundamentally things are going to change, and fundamentally they're going to change because there is sound engineering, sound science behind many of this. So we really need to think about how we are going to partner in this with the world from India. So that's the basic flow of this talk. So the next 20-25 minutes, I will talk about some broad definitions of this field so that we are all on the same page when we talk about some of the other ideas we pursue in our work. So if I just look at the first level, statistics used to be boring, but with machine learning and AI, statistics is back in vogue. So there's a lot of, statisticians might not, would never have expected the kind of pay packages that they're getting right now. So what is statistics? I usually like to come up with one-line definitions of things that makes it, what is the most important thing that you would like to say if you want to say about a field. Okay, statistics, there are just so much. I would say from an engineer's viewpoint, statistics allows us the ability to work with uncertain data. If there was no uncertainty in any data that we see, we would not require any statistics at all. So statistics allows us and provides us a mathematical framework to work with uncertain data. And why am I saying this? Because all data is uncertain, as we know, uncertain because of measurement errors, uncertain because of human biases, and uncertain simply because people lie. Okay, so you need a method to be able to look at all of this data and work with uncertain data. That is statistics. And this is something that is very relevant for data science, because the definition of data science, according to me, is the science of deriving insights from data. So if I just gave you data, it is mere data. How would you use the data and derive insights that are worthwhile, that leads to actionable things and so on? So that is data science. And the key challenge in data science is you have data which is uncertain. You have to derive insight. So how do you do that? That's the question. Now, there's a lot of confusion between what is data science and machine learning. So I'm going to define machine learning as the science of mimicking human learning. And there are certain important aspects here, the way I think about it. The word mimicking is important because we really we know what human learning is. We feel that we know what we learn and so on, but exactly how it is done is still not clear. So basically, we are going to abandon the idea of exactly finding out how human learning occurs, but we are going to come up with computer systems that mimic this aspect of human learning is what we are going to look at for machine learning. I'll come back to what AI is subsequently. So these are broad definitions for statistics, data science, and machine learning. And from an engineer's viewpoint, if you don't have some formalism to think about how these things happen, then it's not really very useful. So though we have to work with imperfect understanding of what human learning is, we are going to say machine learning is going to mimic human learning through these things. OK, so it's going to learn something. And if I say machine learning learns something, then I have to say, what is it that it learns? How does it learn it? And finally, how does it convert this into action? And remember, this is mimicking. This is our framework for thinking about this. And in literature, what is learned and how is learned is typically what is called as learning, the machine learning part of it. And then how is it converted to action is reasoning, decision making, and so on. So if you want to think of an example of this, if I learn to ride a cycle, okay, so what do I learn when I learn to ride a cycle? How do I learn it? And finally, once I learn this, how do I convert it to action? So somehow in cycling, I learn how to keep my position so that the cycle does not fall and I propel myself forward. What is exactly that I learn, I'll come back to in the next slide. And how do I convert it to action? So when I take a cycle again, I can cycle and go from point A to point B. That's how I'm converting whatever I've learned into action. Now, if you think about this, this is true for language that you learn. It is true for the preferences that you understand. It is true for looking at data and then learning something from the data. So all of this there is some aspect of learning, and we are trying to kind of categorize it in a very systematic framework so that we can start thinking about how this is done. So the most important thing in machine learning is essentially machine learning for the largest part, right? Machine learning algorithms solve two types of problems. Okay, so one problem is called the classification problem. The other problem is called the function approximation problem. So in the left-hand side of this picture, top left, I have shown a classification problem. Think of this as two variables, x1 and x2, and I have data, so the circle data and star data. And I say the circle data is belonging to class 1 and the star data belongs to class 2. Now I want to identify when I get a new data point whether it belongs to class 1 or class 2. The simplest way to do this is to draw a line, and depending on which side of the line you are, you say it's either circle class or the star class. Now on the right side top, the same problem. Now you have a nonlinear boundary. And one side of the boundary you have the circle class and the other side you have the star class. Okay, so this is called classification problem. So the idea is to generate these boundaries so that these data points belonging to different classes are as far away from the boundary as possible. On the other hand, if you think of the bottom panel of this picture, this is called a function approximation problem, where I have an input x and I'm predicting an output y. And the left picture is something all of us have seen hundreds of times, I'm assuming, which is a linear regression. And the right hand side is a nonlinear regression. The difference between these two plots is that this boundary region that you do in the classification problem, you want to generate it in such a way the data points are as far away from this boundary as possible. In function approximation, what you want to do is you want the boundary to be right in the midst of this data. Okay, but nonetheless, the key point that I want the audience to take is what is learned are these functional forms. Okay, so that is the basic first step. So when we learn something in classification, we call those as decision boundaries that are learned. And when we learn this function in function approximation, that is a prediction model or the model or a function that is learned. So it's either a decision boundary or a function. So this is what is learned. Okay. Now, the interesting thing to remember here is if you were to just do a thought experiment and then say, hey, this looks very simple. What is the big deal with this, right? Now, imagine that this I have given you just in two variables. Imagine now I give you 10,000 variables, millions of data points, okay, and let's say 10 different classes, and then I say, okay, do classification. Now the first thing is you cannot plot like this. It's a 1,000 dimensional problem, millions of data points, 10 classes, and immediately the problem is, can I come up with in multiple dimensions? These lines become what are called hyperplanes. Can I come up with hyperplanes that will be able to separate these classes? If hyperplanes don't do it, what functional form do I use? When you have a linear problem, the functional form is very clear. The minute you go into nonlinear problems, the world is your oyster, as they speak, and you can think of infinite number of functional forms that you can use. So how do you solve this problem, and how do you find this functional form which will allow us to solve this machine learning problem? That is where the crux of the algorithms are. Okay, so if world were a nice, or the way we represent data were a nice 2D representation, you don't need any machine learning. You can visually see this. But when you really blow up the number of dimensions, it becomes very hard to do this. And particularly when you blow up the number of options that are there in terms of the nonlinear functions and so on, it becomes almost impossible to do this. And that is what machine learning algorithms do. And this is the core of what is learned as far as machine learning goes. Okay, now I talked about statistics and I talked about why statistics has become so important in this context of machine learning. This is because of the following: whether you're doing in 1,000 variable or 1,000 dimensional or 10,000 dimensional problem, whether you're trying to understand a decision function or a function approximator, there is always a difficulty because you always start with the data matrix, right? The data matrix has your multidimensional data for different samples. And this data matrix is always with uncertainty. And if I were to simply write it very mathematically, I would say I have a data matrix and there is a portion of which is true and a portion of which is error or uncertainty. So I can think of this data matrix in a very simplistic sense as being broken down into T plus U. The beauty of this is when I get the data matrix, I don't know how to break this up. Okay, so I don't know how much is uncertainty and I don't know how much is the truth. And I have to kind of cull out the truth and build a model based on this truth so that I can predict in future. So this definitely leads to already an ill-posed problem. So for example, I could say U is 0 and the equation becomes A equal to T, in which case basically I'm saying there is no uncertainty here. Whether that's really the truth, we don't know. We really need to think about it. Or I could simply say T is 0. All your data is completely random data. Okay. Now, or anything in between. So there are infinite number of solutions for this T and U matrix. So statistics gives you a formalism to start thinking about this. And that's the reason why statistics is very, very important in machine learning and so on. So essentially, we have to learn the underlying functional form, which we don't know any idea about. It can be one of the millions of possible functional forms that could be there. And I have to do this on top of not knowing what functional form I am going for with uncertainty in data. Okay, so this is the classical problem of machine learning. And if I solve for a decision boundary, then it's a classification problem. If I solve for the model, it's a function approximation problem. Now, in the last 20 years, tremendous progress has been made into solving this basic problem. And this comes in the garb of several algorithms, several optimization algorithms, several machine learning algorithms, and so on. But fundamentally, all of them are solving this. So this is what is learned. Now, how is it learned? Uses a very, very standard engineering principle. When you read these machine learning papers, you will find a lot of philosophy about how I train and so on. But ultimately, I believe almost, in fact, I will make a wager and say almost every machine learning algorithm is essentially ultimately implementing some form of an optimization algorithm. So when I told you that I have this infinite number of functions and I want to figure out which function it is, basically I do a trial and error. I keep picking a function and then each function is parameterized by some parameters. Then I fit that to the data. And how do I fit that to the data? Through an optimization approach. Okay, so if I fit that to the data and through an optimization approach, I find the parameters. If it works great, I've solved some really difficult problem. Okay, so that is how we learn, basically through optimization, which is fitting a model to data. Now, you can, you might say I'll do this in a supervised fashion, unsupervised fashion, whatever it might be. Ultimately, there will be an underlying optimization formulation that you can come up with. Now, when I'm saying this, you might be asking this question as to, well, you said there are millions of functions. How do I actually choose one of those? There are so many choices. So we'll come back to that, how machine learning does that. Okay, and so I talked about what is learned. I talked about how is it learned. And finally, the question of how do I make decisions? Again, I make decisions based on optimization. So once I have a model, and then I want to ask this question, what should I do so that I maximize my profit? Or what do I do so that I maximize my happiness? Whatever that question might be, most of the actions are actually driven by some underlying objective that you have. And that again is solved as an optimization problem. So what is learned are these models. How is it learned is using optimization. And once I have a model, when I use that model in a new situation, again, I'm going to use that model in an optimization framework with a certain objective that I want to maximize or minimize. I want to make something with the least cost. I want to maximize my happiness, whatever it might be. And even very abstract notions, you can actually put them into some mathematical framework in terms of what you are optimizing. And that's how actions are taken. So this is basically the whole notion of machine learning. And this kind of classification makes us understand machine learning better and kind of eschews these romantic notion that programs are being automatically written, though that's also starting to happen. But mostly machine learning, as we see, can be thought of and understood in this framework. Now, an interesting thing that I want to show here is the following. if you look at the question of, you said there are millions of functions that can be used. Which one do I use? So the mathematical trick is you have a bag of functions and you find a function that best fits the true actual function. OK, and that's where you have an error and you have this success rate of 70%, 80% and so on. So that's one way of taking a smaller set of functions and then representing a much larger bag of functions, which is called approximation theory. The other approach, which is what neural networks and so on use, is to have what is called a basis function and then keep adding more and more basis function in a structure so that you explain a much more complicated function. And we know this is nothing new. For example, if you do a Fourier expansion, you have cosine and sine basis functions, and you have some nice orthogonal properties, and you can keep adding these functions more and more. Larger number of functions will represent any time series, for example. So the same idea is what is there in neural nets, where you have these basis functions and put a structure around it, and you're able to explain any other function. So the nice thing mathematically here is, instead of thinking about millions of different functions which you have no idea about, you are able to look at a very small set of functions and then make structures around this. And once you get the correct structure, you get the correct function. So this is the basic idea of machine learning. And why does machine learning look sometimes like godly thing, right? So I'm not able to do this. How is this machine learning technique does this? It's very simple, because when you remember the two-dimensional example I showed you, from our human cognition viewpoint, the way we do things, if it's few variables, few number of data points, and few classes, we can actually very easily do this. But when I really scale the data to millions and scale the variables to million and scale the options to million using this kind of mathematical techniques, suddenly this problem becomes so vast that we can't do it. So I give you some data like this and I say, look, as a human, make a decision with this. You will make a decision which will be very suboptimal. However, if you ran a really powerful computer, which is going to check, let's say, million possible functions, okay? And let's say in this huge variable problem, there is one function which actually fits this data very well. This algorithm is going to find it, which you have no chance of finding. Now, when the algorithm makes decisions with this function that it has found, it will really look like you will not even be able to see why this algorithm is doing this, because you have no clue about that underlying function because of the vastness of data, variables, and so on. Then you'll say, man, this machine learning thing has just learned something unimaginable. I cannot understand the decisions this thing is making. And all of that is basically the compute power and the fundamental mathematics that I outlined now. A happy confluence of that towards this. So this is machine learning. Now, one important thing is, I can go and give this talk in NCL. I can go and give this talk in National Stock Exchange. I can go and give this talk to some NLP audience. I can give this talk in chemistry, whatever it is. So somehow this machine learning seems to cross-cut every possible discipline, because physics, people are talking about machine learning, chemistry, people are talking about machine learning. Why does that happen? It happens basically because of two fundamental reasons to a large extent. And I'm going to tell you this. Many problems that we solve in multiple disciplines can either be categorized as classification or function approximation problems. Here I have given you some example. So whenever we do a credit card transaction, sometimes we get this call saying, did you actually make this transaction? And that is basically a classification problem where a transaction is classified as genuine or not genuine. We keep getting lots of emails. Wouldn't it be nice if there is a program which basically understands spam and sends it to spam? Of course, we have something like this now, which does not really use serious AI principles. But if you could do that, that's a classification problem. Distinguishing between different products in a retail store is a classification problem. Identifying defective, non-defective items. So you see, various fields, these are classification problems. Similarly, if you were to start thinking about predicting materials property for different molecular structures, that is a function approximation problem. If you want to predict scores in a cricket match, that is a function approximation problem. This is very close to my heart. If any of you watch Cricinfo commentary, and if you look at the scorecard now, there is always a win probability that comes with the scorecard nowadays. And that is all through the algorithms that we have developed. We actually predict what the score is likely to be, and based on that give a win probability. That is again a functional approximation problem. If you want to predict kinetic parameters in biochemical reactions, functional approximation problem. If you want to take a game of chess and then predict a value for a board position, that is a functional approximation problem. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, once we have this notion of function approximation and classification problems, and what is learned, how is it learned, and so on, then you quickly see that so many problems, all of them fall into these buckets. And that's the reason why machine learning has become so pervasive. And I can keep adding example after example here in a variety of fields, biology, chemistry, physics, chemical engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical. And the nice thing is they all get bucketed into this. But it is facile to just say they get bucketed into this. There is one more idea that allows this bucketing to be solved by a machine learning algorithm. The key point here is, when people develop these machine learning algorithms, they are completely doing it in a domain agnostic fashion. Right? They are developing algorithm not for chemical engineering or not for mechanical engineering. However, these algorithms are being used by chemical engineers, being used by mechanical engineers, with very little change to the algorithm itself. Okay, which is a really different thing, because when we go from one field to another, when we translate one field to another, let's say we want to take something we are doing in heat transfer to mass transfer, we still have to think about how does it translate. I have to make it specific to the domain of application. However, the beautiful idea of bucketing these into these problems, and the next idea I'm going to discuss, allows us to really develop these algorithms in a domain agnostic fashion, and then use these algorithms with all of these problems that we are trying to solve. Okay, so ML techniques are universally applicable because of the notion of what I'm going to call as features. So in the previous slides, for example, let's just take one problem. For example, let's say we take transaction ID to figure out credit card, whether it's fraud or genuine. If I just gave you data, which is, let's say, 1,000 transaction IDs with a label saying this is genuine, this is fraud, and transaction ID is only what time, some arbitrary format, that you cannot say, oh, well, this is a classification problem, I'll just use IDs to do the classification. It's simply not possible. So while it's, as I said before, it's facile to say it's a classification problem, one has to really think about, how do I convert this to a classification problem? That conversion happens by taking a transaction ID and then developing what is called a feature list. So for each transaction, you might add data to say who bought this. Is it a male or a female? What was the amount of money spent? What was bought? Where was it bought? Okay, so if you keep adding more and more data like that for each of these transactions, then you can quickly see how an algorithm might be able to exploit this idea to do a classification. So for example, if it's a card that a male predominantly uses, but now it's been used by a female for a female clothing much higher than what is usually spent in a totally different location, then you know that this is not falling in pattern. Right? So this notion of converting each of these into a feature list, which gives you informative information about the problem that's being solved, is another critical aspect. So for every one of the problems that I showed you in the previous two slides, we can actually come up with a feature list which will tell you how you have to structure the problem. So if you want to take the materials property prediction for different molecular structures, you can develop features such as types and number of atoms. You can have 1D descriptors, which are structural fragments groups, 2D descriptors, angle, graph properties, 3D descriptors, volume, steric properties, and you can have any derived descriptor, which could be based on more fundamental calculations, first principles calculations, and so on. So ultimately, for a structure which is just a molecular formula, you add more and more, and now you have the data matrix A. And once you have the data matrix A, on the other side, these algorithms are completely agnostic to how this data was generated. All it looks at is it a quantitative data? Is it a string? Whatever that is, that description is needed, and that's enough for machine learning algorithms to work. So just to give you an idea, if you take off any machine learning algorithm, and I have several here, you can basically see whether it's a classification or a function approximation algorithm. I have more of this. I just wanted to show you this so that you kind of understand from a holistic picture what is machine learning, what is done in machine learning, and why is it so pervasive in every field? And therein lies the most important message of this lecture, which is that whether you are a chemical engineer, mechanical engineer, whatever you are, it is time to pay attention to this. And there are lots of algorithms here which we can actually leverage and use for solving many of our problems. Okay, so that is machine learning. So I have now come to about half an hour. So let me talk about AI and go on to the other things. So we talked about machine learning. So what is the difference between AI and machine learning? So in my mind, I'm going to use a broader term. For machine learning, we said mimicking machine learning. Here I'm going to say mimicking human intelligence. And human intelligence, the current flavor is this is called artificial general intelligence, which basically could include many aspects of intelligence. Of course, human learning is part of it. But there are also other things like leaps of insight. So what does a leap of insight mean? So let's say you're looking at planetary motion, and then you're saying, oh, there is a sun and there are these planets rotating around it, and then suddenly you get this flash of brilliance that everything in the world might be grossly represented in this fashion. The table that you're seeing, the computer that I'm seeing, everything is somehow coming in the same structure. So you say, well, there is an atomic structure, and then say there is a core and there are electrons going around in circles. Okay, so that kind of leap of insight is something that humans have done and are capable of doing. Can computers do it? And this notion of consciousness, and you read more and more about consciousness, and top scientists will say it's still not yet very well defined, but there is this notion of we know what we are doing. Does the computer know what it is doing? So I know I am giving this talk, but does the computer know that it is projecting a PowerPoint, right? So and that itself is a very vague question. And so how do we answer these questions? And in fact, I was in some talk a few years back, and someone asked, will computers become conscious? And I really like the answer of the speaker. The speaker said, look, we kind of, for all things that we don't know, we put it under some major category called consciousness, and then say we don't have that. But maybe the answer is not, the question maybe is not that whether computers will become conscious, but is there the concept of consciousness itself, does it make sense? Or in other words, can I break it into smaller and smaller parts that I put together? Suddenly what you think of consciousness is something much simpler than what it is. So there's all kinds of viewpoints here, philosophical, but that is the general AI. The key features that people believe in general AI are representation, reasoning, and decision making. And clearly, it's very difficult to realize in its most expansive conceptualization that we talked about. What we see is more narrow AI. What does AI include? Games, automated reasoning, robotics, vision, NLP. And this ties into the other point that I made about we have AI as a pervasive thing. All of you would have seen some or other aspect of your life being affected by this. For example, Siri, or for example, these translating systems, and so on. So AI is not a single technology. So anything that a human does, whichever seems to represent human intelligence, vision, our ability to speak, our ability to understand each other, all of those come under AI systems. And of these, the most popular now is the deep network, and deep networks are a way to achieve narrow AI. And of course, there is this other idea of reinforcement learning, which is how, remember in machine learning, I kind of talked about what is learned, how is it learned, how are the decisions taken. If you put all of them together into a single box and do all of them together nicely, that is reinforcement learning, and automatic programming, hardware for AI. So a whole host of things are included in current AI. Okay, just I'll in the interest of time, I had a little more slides on deep networks and so on. I'm going to not spend so much time on that, except to say that if you go to a AI conference now, it's largely about neural nets. and these deep neural networks and so on. However, this was not always the case before, and many chemical engineers have made very good contributions here, but there is a whole host of ideas that used to come under AI, such as graph theoretical models, rule-based systems, semantic networks, ontologies, which are now coming back again, agent-based models, stochastic models, Petri nets, and so on. So there are a whole host of frameworks that come under AI, and collectively this is what we would call as AI techniques. And any problem that seems like a human intelligence problem that these techniques are solving is what we would call as AI. Okay, so I'm going to skip these slides in the interest of time. Just one important point that I want to mention here is, so I told you when I went in 1990 to do a PhD, I started working in AI. So and AI is started, I think the first conference or where they discussed it somewhere in the 1950s, if I remember right. So it's been there for so long. So why suddenly this great interest in AI in the last 10 years? Just to give you an idea, if I look at computing in 1985, the fastest computer was a Cray 2 supercomputer, which had about 1.9 gigaflops. It used to produce apparently 150 kilowatts of heat, heat enough to run a bus, and used to cost about $40 million in 2015 exchange in the time frame of 2015, if you were to project that cost. So that's the kind of device that you had. In 2015, you have something which is 3 gigaflops, which uses 1 watt, and it's cost only $300. This is the specs of an Apple iWatch. So you can see the Moore's law working, and then this ability to do compute. In fact, if you want to think about this, everyone has a supercomputer of 1985 in their hands now, in their hands now, and your laptop and computers are much better. Okay, so this kind of computational possibility and the mobile technology, ability to generate data from anywhere and use it and so on, have really made a difference in terms of how AI has come back again with a bang. And this compute allows us to do all kinds of crazy computations in terms of scale that I talked about in machine learning and neural networks. I still remember when I used to train these neural networks for my PhD, a very small network, you have to put it for training and go home and come 2 days later, lock your computer screen and then come back and you'll get results. Now that will be done in not milliseconds, less. So you can do much larger networks. So your ability to do this has really tremendously increased. And that is the reason why we see this explosion of the ideas in AI and so on. So now I'll come back. I have again, in the interest of time, because I also want to get to the other AI things, which is important, I think, so that we start thinking about using AI a lot more as a tool in research itself. So I have quite a few slides in our work in our lab. I'll just kind of show you 2 very interesting things that we are trying to do. And then the industrial projects I'll skip in this talk and go on to the next step. Okay, so one area that I'm very interested in is microfluidics. In fact, within microfluidics, I'm interested in droplet microfluidics, more like a systems engineer for now, slowly going towards applications. For people, I think droplet microfluidics is a much more maybe known area to this audience than AI, ML, and so on. But droplet microfluidics basically is having very narrow channels and have a continuous phase and a dispersed phase, which is a droplet moving around. And the advantages of droplet microfluidics is that when you have these very small drops, you can do multiple things. Each one can be thought of as a reactor. You can control the concentrations very well in space and time and all that. Okay, now one way to do lots of, think of doing a lab on a chip or a process on a chip. You have these droplets. One way of moving these droplets around is in a network, just like your road network. You send droplets in, and then they go to the different sections of the network, and that way you can sort droplets, you can merge droplets, you can take them to a separate section of this network, and then heat them, cool them, whatever you want. Okay, so our interest is in coming up with these kinds of networks where you can do these things. And there are a lot more fascinating things that people have shown. So I'm just going to give you some examples. So here is a paper in Science which came quite a while back, where they said microfluidic bubble logic or droplet computers. Here the idea is how you can actually generate Boolean logic using droplet network. So this is a flip-flop. If you notice, once the droplet comes to this side and the other side, so if you think of with the droplet as 1, so then it is a 0-1 flip-flop that is occurring here. Here, this is what is called as a ring oscillator. If you'll notice, there's only one droplet in one section of the ring, so the other sections are 0. So if you were to do a binary coding, it will be 1 0 0 0 1 0 0 0 1 and so on, and it'll keep repeating. Now here is a third example. Here are two droplets that are coming in at different times, but through a ladder network they go, and at the end they are synchronized. So this is called a synchronizer. So this is kind of what you can do with these kinds of networks in logical operations. We are trying to see whether we can do the same thing for floating point operations, and more from an engineering viewpoint, whether we can do sorting, searching, and so on. So you might say, where does AI come in all of this? So we have been looking at doing these network designs using what are called reinforcement learning techniques. So reinforcement learning is very simple idea. So if you ask a child, how does a child learn not to touch fire, right? So there are two ways in which you can do. One way is for a dad or mom to go and tell the child, don't put your finger into the fire because it will hurt. Okay, so that is basically supervised learning. The other approach is just don't do anything. The child looks at the fire and then it feels, there's something shiny, so tries to go and touch it and immediately gets burned. So the idea that I should never touch this gets reinforced, right? And this is how we learn cycling. So for example, when we try to balance our body, initially we don't know, we fall, and then we learn from that fall why we are falling, and then keep changing the way we move. So we have shown some very interesting results in our lab. The video is actually, there are two drops that are coming in. There is a low resistance drop that comes in first, and then a high resistance drop comes later. But when they go out, they are flipped. Just a very simple example. We have done multiple examples like this for sorting, sequencing, and so on, just to make the point. And this network was identified actually using reinforcement learning. So we used an AI technique to identify this. So this is just one example of how you can start thinking about using these techniques in very interesting engineering problems. Okay, here is another example of, again, this is not flipping, this is sorting, sending the red droplet to the top arm and the green droplet to the bottom arm. And again, this was a design that was, in terms of their spacing, that was designed using reinforcement learning. So the point I'm trying to make is, in a short talk, I cannot explain to you the mechanics of how this was done, but I'm trying to show you that a variety of problems that now, which are difficult to solve, you can start thinking about using some of these techniques. And sometimes these techniques give you really interesting results. We have solved the same problem using traditional genetic algorithms and so on. But what we see is, when we see the results, it is the kind of structures that a genetic algorithm comes up with is very different from the kind of structures a reinforcement learning algorithm comes up with, though both solve the problem. So that kind of gives you a lot of understanding and starting to think about how do these things happen, how are these designs being picked out, and so on. So it's a really fascinating field where you can actually marry two things, and it makes the intellectual thinking for us much more rich. So that's this. Another area which I'll quickly talk about before going on to the last bit of my talk is natural language processing. This is going to have a very huge impact in terms of how scientific discoveries are done, I really believe. In fact, there was a paper in Nature which actually talked about using NLP to identify materials, and they did a really fantastic example of this. So what they did was, they had a corpus of all abstracts till, let's say, I don't remember the exact years, but the philosophy is this. So let's say they took the corpus of all literature in the materials area that they are interested in, let's say till 2015. And they did some NLP processing, and then they said, let me find out a material which will have certain thermoelectric properties. Okay, and then just based on this corpus and doing NLP, they figured out a material. The algorithm did a material. The most interesting thing is in 2015, this material was not even being talked about. But by 2017, because we are doing this retrospectively, this material already been found, and that was the material that was being talked about for this property. So what they were able to demonstrate is you can look at this corpus and come up with at least really out of the box ideas for materials that you can use. And in this case, they actually showed that no one was talking about this in 2015, but suddenly this became the material of choice. So we are trying to look at this and then trying to see whether we can do this kind of natural language processing for battery designs and so on. And this is just one field. You can use this in multiple fields, and lots of people are looking at this. So these are the kinds of things that we do with AI and our own applications. And we are also looking at other problems such as if I give you very base level information, can you actually generate knowledge hierarchies automatically and so on? So that has very interesting implications such as, do birds speak to each other? Sounds like a very crazy question to ask, but is there a way to think about that from machine learning AI and so on? And the reason why I mentioned this problem is because again, I just want to, I'm assuming this is predominantly chemical engineering, other engineering, chemist audience. I think all of us have to partake in this exciting developments in AI. It is not only computer scientists, and that's a point I want to make again and again. And these kinds of questions anyone can ask, and the tools are so well developed now, anyone can start working with this. Okay, I'm going to skip these, and I'm going to finish in the next 10 minutes within my 1 hour. Just one quick thing from an industrial application perspective. While we can all go gung-ho about AI and ML being used in manufacturing and so on, just one caveat that I want to show. Anytime you read in these magazines and so on, these are great AI ML applications, you will see these are the general characteristics of these. The return on investment is very easy to conceptualize and compute. For example, any social media AI solution has a real money potential. And if the accuracy is not great, you don't have to really worry about it. So for example, if Netflix tells you you are 97% likely to like a movie, and if you don't like it, you're not going to say, I'm going to throw Netflix away. But I can't tell you that you have a 97% probability of taking the flight and reaching your place, right? So in engineering applications, the accuracy becomes very important. Large amounts of data is available. Data hygiene might not be a concern for all these successful applications. We can generate synthetic data, and labeling data might not be a problem. For example, if you're looking at a driverless car, labeling scenarios is not at all difficult. However, if you're looking at an engineering fault detection diagnosis problem, if I give you data and I don't tell you what happened, labeling that as a particular fault itself is a difficult thing. That's the reason why manufacturing analytics is still difficult, which is where a lot of us work on. It's still not at a big data problem. Data is in silos. Existing data is messy. Very difficult, it seems like, to do this cookie cutter approach. Though I talked about machine learning as a generic solution, you still have to do a lot of work to put it into that framework, and that does not seem to be a very standard approach. Quite a bit of reliance on domain knowledge, and of course, robustness and reliability are of major concerns. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of problems we look at in our lab, and the last 10 minutes I'll take to describe some of the very exciting developments that are happening in AI and the implications in science and engineering. Okay, so the notion is there is going to be this superhuman AI. How far are we from that? If you look at games, right, we are already there. Okay, so if you look at game playing, the games that used to be in the domain of humans and no computer could beat humans, that we have far gone past, and we are at a place where humans cannot beat these games. In fact, I still remember again at Purdue in 1990s, I still remember an article that says, will computers ever beat grandmasters in chess? But now the answer is very clear, and the answer is very, very clear in the sense that no human can beat computers, right? So here is one example. This is taken from DeepMind. This is this AlphaGo with no information about any training data sets, only the rules about the game known. You can see how these programs start beating the best players, and this is just remarkable. This was kind of unthinkable maybe 25 years back. And the same thing happened in chess also. Again, the traditional way of building AI systems were to kind of do the rule base. You can talk to grandmasters, learn from them, and codify that. That's how Stockfish works, and then do a search on this. Now the chess playing games now, they're given only the rules. They play against each other, and they get to grandmaster level without any opening preparation, other data, and so on. So this is kind of remarkable. So remarkable that you can see some of the moves that were made. So for example, this one from a beautiful article that came in New York Times about this chess game. Most unnerving was that AlphaZero seemed to express insight. It played like no computer has, intuitively and beautifully, with a romantic attacking style. In game 10, AlphaZero retreated its queen back into the corner of the backboard on its own side. For people who play chess, at least some semi-professional, you would have been told you have to centralize, you have to control the center middle of the board. So this is completely counterintuitive. And no one understood this, but just this one move showed that it was such a brilliant move to win that game, right? So that has already happened. And because this has happened, there's a lot of interest. There is an idea of AI designing AI. So here is an example. So most of the algorithms are human defined, right? So if you do logistic regression, linear regression, whatever it is, human defined. So people started asking this question: if I just gave this basic math operations, can I have a system which will keep playing around with this math operations and finally come up with machine learning algorithms? And for simple problems here, they show that actually we give them just the basic math operations and then let them evolve. They will actually figure out the machine learning algorithms themselves, which is AI designing AI, which came out in 2020, which is a very interesting development in my view. In terms of mathematics, there is this Ramanujan mission, which basically generates this continuing fractions for different newer fractions. In fact, if you go work with this and come up with a conjecture, apparently you can name yourself to the conjecture, and you can prove those conjectures and so on. This group in Facebook came up with a symbolic math AI, which solves symbolic math problems. 5,000 problems they have solved. Google's AI mathematician proves theorems. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is AI is really moving ahead in terms of things that we keep saying are really in the preserve of human cognition. It's very difficult for a machine to do. They seem to be doing many of these. AI researcher, there is a robot scientist called Adam, which was able to identify genes that encode particular enzymatic activities for yeast. There is another machine learning AI tool, which is an ML with robotics and automated microscopy. With no prior knowledge, it was able to do only 29% of all possible experiments and then understand this complete field. And I can go on and on. So the point here is this notion of having these AI systems do things that scientists do, generate hypotheses and so on, is growing. And I think as scientists and engineers, we should take advantage of these systems, not think of these as adversaries, as ways to generate hypotheses and ways to do things quicker. And that's where science and engineering is going to go, in my view. And there are many more applications. People who work in protein folding would have heard of the spectacular success of this AlphaFold, which solves some real complicated protein folding problems and so on. Okay, so finally, some critique of AI. Still, when someone says this chess program beats the greatest players, the kind of compute power and the actual electricity and the power it uses, it's not at all comparable to human. So the real holy grail is how. So I actually flipped the question. It is not surprising to me that computers beat humans in chess and other games anymore. it is surprising to me that humans are playing these computers up to 45-50 moves, on an almost equal footing before they lose. So how is it that a human is only, so grandmasters are typically supposed to look at 6 moves ahead or whatever that number is, and these computers are looking at many moves ahead, right? How is it that we are able to do such compact reasoning? Okay, so that's an important question. So there are the flip side of all of this, and I have not spent too much time in this lecture on the flip sides. All I wanted to say was that there is a lot of promise, and of course this is not a panacea to everything, but there are flip sides, but it's important that we pay attention to this. Of course, the other big criticism of this is the games and so on, they are well-defined environment, but in a real life, imagine driving in India, right? There are so many uncertainties, things that you cannot think will happen. So can AI systems work there is another open question. So where are we going? So from an AI viewpoint, I think the whole idea is to go from supervised to unsupervised learning, from narrow AI to general AI, and basically from brute force search, which is what I said, you keep searching for all of these functions and figure out what is the best, to sophisticated learning, so that you can actually do this compact learning. Okay, and the idea is just like how a chess game, given just the basic moves and no other prior information, is able to come up with the whole strategy and become a grandmaster that no one can beat. In the same way, if I give some minimum scientific facts, can I get a scientist who will be a super scientist, right? So that is where this whole field is going. Okay, so one last slide and then I'll stop. So what should we be doing? So the first thing I think we have to understand is AI in some form or the other is here to stay. I've just said only mild winters from now on. So they always have these AI winters. After a boom of activity, nothing happens, right? But I don't think that's going to happen anymore. Even if it happens, it will be for a short time, because there is going to be this eclectic mix of multiple things that are happening. Computation is still going to get improved. We don't know what will happen to quantum computers. Those might be a game changer. And because so many people are doing so many things, we might identify scientific principles which can really propel this. So I think it's here to say, at best, it can revolutionize the way humankind progresses in our lifetimes. But even if you say at worst, there will be thousands of applications which are already seen, and no nation can afford to be left behind. So what should we be doing? If you look at many of these, I honestly believe the thinking and the algorithmic thinking is not that complicated. Many of us can do, and there's a whole scientific body in India that can work on it. What we need is an ecosystem where people work together. There is an excitement about this whole field. And of course, we have to scale up our compute infrastructure to world-class levels. So it's very, very difficult to compete. Again, it's like humans competing with computers. If you have lower compute power, you cannot compete with a higher compute power organization or a country. What should researchers do? I think it's time to be very bold, imaginative in this area, and think big. Think about solving some real nice problem using AI. And go after it. And the reason why I think it's time for us to do it is because I think there is a tremendous democratization of infrastructure, right? Both algorithms and hardware freely available. You just go to a library, anything that is developed by someone. In fact, there's something called AI Feynman, which is trying to understand whether from data it can come up with physical principles. This is open source code. I had one of my students download it and work with it. That's how simple it is. Right? So the only real thing that you need is actually intelligence. That's all. Everything in terms of algorithms and hardware. Hardware, for example, you have these Arduinos and other things that make it so easy to work with this system. So I think it's time that we really paid attention to this a lot more. And of course, I work with lots of companies, and the big problem in India is many times you work with companies very, very impatient. They want results tomorrow at your own cost. So companies also have to start thinking much more broadly if they want to be competitive using local talent. Okay, so with that, I will stop my talk, and I will be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raghu, for this very detailed description of, AI and the fact that AI is for everyone, but at the same time, AI is not a silver bullet. For touching upon machine learning and classification methods as sort of implicit to a lot of ML and AI techniques. So I would like to raise the, open the board to questions from all my scientist colleagues. I would request them to raise their hands and they could ask the question live. Alternately, they could also type their questions in the chat box and I will read out the question from there. So I have a few hands already raised. I will go in the order.
Anu, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, Sarika, I think she has a bit of bandwidth problem, so maybe you might have better bandwidth. You could take over.
Okay. Yeah, so I can then start. I raise my hand, but I'll take I'll give myself a chance at the end. So maybe the first question can be Dr. Ashish Ortwin. Ashish, you can go ahead and say what you want to ask.
Ashish, muted.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Hey, thanks, Raghu, for a wonderful talk. I mean, with no background, it was very well described about nuances and going way forward. So I think you touched upon this. Going forward, assuming that AI comes in a big way in the next 10 years or something, do you envisage the bottlenecks in terms of the advancement in the computational power and the data storage? I mean, do you think this can happen? Because AI is not really big at this point of time. But if it happens across all the disciplines, across entire disciplines, and it goes in a big way, do you envisage that the computational power and the data storage advancement may not go at that way? Do you think that can happen?
So my answer is actually right now there is enough computational power, right, for all of us to really take advantage of AI. So even now, I think let's look at the situation now. I think if you look at in different engineering disciplines, it is still suboptimal. There is a lot to do already by actively participating in this AI. And as I said before, many of these things are not known to people. The kind of, in fact, this paper on this AutoML, it's very fascinating. It is just basic math operations and it is actually coming up with algorithms. Okay, so can chemical engineers set up some basic ideas and then say, will we come up with surface renewal theory? Right, those kinds of experiments, it's very easy to do now. It's not at all difficult. But I think that orientation itself will make a big difference in all of the basic organizations. Now, the broader question of this artificial general intelligence and so on, it's a little bit like COVID. No one knows. So they did a survey of so-called experts in this, and someone said we will see AGI in 19 years. And another expert said it will take 400 years. So you see the breadth of this. So basically, no one really knows, and there are many uncertainties, right? For example, they keep saying Moore's law will stop at some time, right? So your compute power can only grow so much more, or the computational power. However, we don't know what a game changer quantum computing is going to be. Okay, so if that picks up, then it's a total game changer. So my gut feeling is in another 25-30 years, we are going to see a very significantly different world than now, is the feeling. And AI is going to have a huge impact in this world. And I think all of us have to get either reconciled to it or actively, enthusiastically participate in it.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question, Dr. Karthikeyan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
See, I am working on AI for some time, and it is very difficult to convince people about explainable AI. One. Yeah. Second thing, access to tensor cores to the researchers, where people are talking about deep network, everything. Okay, machine learning we can do with existing CPUs and other things. Now, when you go to deep learning, we need tensor cores. So what is your comments about GPUs, Tensor Core, and explainable AI for India to take up the research in chemical sciences or any other sciences?
So
I also complimented your presentation because it was very timely for NCL, and we wrote about AI in 20-30 years back. But now next 30 years, if it has to survive, today we should start something. Your comments, please.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, Karthikeyan. So let me answer the second question first, which you talked about. If you want to really go into very deep AI techniques, compute facilities are required. I think so there are multiple task force, and unfortunately in India. I don't know, it's being recorded, but still I'm going to say. So there are multiple task force at the end, it almost feels like which task force is going to find the solution. I think this is not going to work like that. I think we really need to look at a national compute resource, and places which have tremendous compute resource need to open their facilities out to others. It has to be cooperative, collaborative, and there has to be new paradigms in terms of computation itself, I feel. So I think you put the finger on the real problem, which is if you want to really compete with the best, you need to be able to really look at centralized real computational power. So that is something that organizations like NCL and others should really think about. How are we going to come up with a scalable model that will work in our country? That is the answer, and I completely agree with you. But I don't think we need to wait. On the flip side, I think there is enough to really do very interesting stuff, and each one of us in our individual capacity can start working on it like you're doing. I think it's a good thing, and I think we should continue doing that. So that is as far as that question is going. Explainable AI is another interesting question, and that is where I think engineers and we have a big leg up, because I think, and that's part of the research that my group works in, which is to really look at, because AI has come and this neural network is there, many people have just abandoned the traditional AI of knowledge representation, reasoning, and so on. So I don't think we should do that. What we should do is we should really look at how does our first principles knowledge combine with AI. So for example, in chess, we just said rules, right? In mathematics, we said the AutoML algorithms, we just say some mathematical operations. Similarly, in chemical engineering, how do I put together the basic first principles knowledge and then build from that? If you do like that, the whole network that is built, everything is based on first principle knowledge, so explainability will become much bigger. So I think that's where I really believe when it goes past the computer science domain to actual domain experts, then the mathematicians think about what operation should I add so that I come up with AutoML. That's why I mentioned the other idea where chemical engineers think about what should I give this technique so that you'll think of a distillation column. Okay, if you pose a problem like that and let an AI figure out a distillation or a reactive separation and so on, then you will see how it is doing. That's a kind of broad thinking that we should have, and that will solve the explainable AI as we go forward.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so there are quite a few questions. Maybe we can have a shorter discussion for the time. So Dr. Chetan Gadgil from NCL Pune. Chetan, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi Raghu, I have a quick question, which is that just as say in statistics, there is a rule of thumb about the number of data points you need, let's say for conducting a t-test. Is there a similar rule of thumb, even for a simple thing like classification into two groups based on number of measurements, number of samples?
This is a standard question, Chet, and
I mean, this goes into that. When should you think of using AI or these methods?
So the simple machine learning algorithms, you can start using them with very, very small amount of data, right? I don't think that is a problem. More fundamental, I think Sarika told me I have to keep my answer short, I think. was that the thing? So let me give my answer very, very short. So this whole lots of questions. Yeah. So in AI, Chetan, the problem is this traditional notion of over parameterization seems to be going out of the window, and no one knows why. That's an open question. So you have a deep neural network which has, let's say, 20,000 data points, but 50,000 parameters. And strangely, the network does very well on generalization also. It's not only on training data. So that's the reason why some of these ideas have to be rethought, and it's an open question still, is what I would say.
Thank you.
The next question by Dr. Paul Ratnaswamy. Dr. Ratnaswamy, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, I am a chemist, not a chemical engineer. Let me make that caveat. There are 3 areas in chemistry of relevance here I see directly. One is synthetic organic chemistry, synthesis of drug molecules. Second, polymer synthesis of specific polymer molecules. Third, catalysis. Let us take one area by area catalysis. Ideally, for example, the normal procedure you make synthesize a catalyst or a polymer or an organic molecule, study its structure and study its application. This is the conventional. Can AI reverse the process? Define an optimal, ideal structure of the polymer. Say PET, polyethylene terephthalate. This is an alternative terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol. We define an ideal structure based on the application, then define an optimal route to synthesize that structure. This is a complete reversal of the currently conventional process. Are there any published papers or applications?
Yeah.
Synthetic chemistry, catalysis, or synthetic polymer synthesis. So any impact will be enormous.
So if I understand the question, so yeah, I heard the question. There were some parts which are not clear, but let me answer this. So I think the question is, can I come up with a polymer structure for a particular application, which is defined by properties? Right.
Exactly. Once you know the optimal structure, you can make a synthesis.
Yeah. So this is actually a problem that AI is addressing, and there are and this is a problem that AI ideas have been addressing for several years now, with some limited success. So the idea is the way it is done, and with more data now, it seems like more possible. So the idea is very simple. So this is broken down into actually a forward problem and a reverse problem. The forward problem is where you have lots of data and then say, look, I give you these structures and somehow you convert them to a set of features, and I give you the properties of these structures, and then I build a model which goes from the structure to property. Now the inverse problem is I have a particular application. Now I give you the properties that I require for this application. Now reverse this AI model that you have, and then give me the structure that will give me this properties. So this is work that quite a few groups are trying, and with some good success in some cases, not so much in other cases. So so long answer short, yes, AI can address this. But if you are interested, please write to me. I can give you papers that are looking at this problem, and I can also help with other literature.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So there is a question on the chat box. What are by Krishnan? I don't know, the full name hasn't come up here. What are 1 or 2 grand challenges in chemical engineering and AI that India should take up in the next few years?
So grand challenges in the grand challenge in AI is really looking at what are the aspects that make this AGI. So anyway, the way the field is going, I think there is this question of how do you understand how systems evolve, okay, and how thinking evolves. So if I want to pose a grand challenge problem in chemical engineering, again I would do very similar to this AlphaGo or AutoML? I would say if I give some basic ideas in chemical engineering and let AI run, will it run enough to identify this whole field of reaction engineering, with this whole field of mass transfer, or will it identify some things which are a combination of these? What will happen? So that would be a very interesting problem that if I were to only pick one, that I'll think about working on. Of course, there are other problems like how do I come up with an AI technique for designing all kinds of microfluidic structures, which is what I'm interested in, so that give me a complicated operation that you want to do. I'll tell you what is the droplet microfluidic structure that will do and so on. So those are more specific science problems. But if you think of a grand challenge problem for the engineering, chemical engineering, something where I figure out what are the basic components and then have an AI technique, keep looking at different things, and then ultimately you'll say, okay, here is a distillation column design that comes out purely unsupervised fashion. Would be a very fascinating thing to see.
So another question on the chat box from, I think this is Dr. Ashwini Nandia. Most of ML algorithms are designed to mimic human behavior. How much reliable is ML generated answers for scientific data, as atom or molecular behavior is not so similar to human behavior? Okay, so ML algorithms are designed to mimic human learning, and this is another standard question where you say, look, are these good enough? So I actually asked a flip question. We build models, right? Are the models good enough? Will the model always find accurate answers? So somehow there is a comfort with what we have been doing. So in some sense, I think if you want to do an apple-to-apple comparison, you basically have to say, okay, I give you the same amount of data and then the same conditions, and let's do a first principles model, machine learning model, and then see which one actually does better. Okay, so that's one answer. But the other answer is actually, for example, this AlphaFold, which solves some of the protein folding structures, is really remarkable. And these are machine learning algorithms that are able to do these things. So in some cases, accuracy has been really good. In some cases, accuracy has not been good at all. In fact, the symbolic math, they showed a very simple, I think 14th for 10th grader math question, symbolic question, it couldn't solve. Okay, so I think what we need to do is not to ask of the moon and sky of these AI algorithms, but see what it is giving and then keep using it and improving ourselves. So again, the word for me is not adversarial, saying, oh, it's going to replace first principles modeling. No, don't worry about it. See what is the use of this and then keep assimilating it. At some point, if it's useful, it's useful. If it's not useful, it's not useful. So next question, there are quite a few left, so we should do it fast. From Dr. Devi Prasad, IMMT. Can you ask your question?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. This is Devi Prasad from IMMT. Actually, I have got 4 questions. If you permit, I will ask one by one. But they are very quick questions. I think quick answers can come. First is, suppose you do.
One question is what you should ask now, the most important one, and give others chance. And if we have time left, you can ask the others too. Okay, thank you. Suppose we are doing a lot of experiments and collecting a lot of data. Now the question for the researcher is how to get the optimized parameters or the inputs for the particular reaction. Suppose I make a model using a neural network with this, then how it is going to find out the optimal inputs for the reaction. Suppose I have a table of data, can I not just get the optimum value getting the best output, or I should model it and feed the other inputs and get the optimum outputs?
Okay, so the idea is the same, right? So if I have a table and let's say whatever you decide is an optimum output, let's say yield. Okay, so you can say, look, I have this data, I'll find the yield values and then kind of do some interpolation and then figure out what inputs might give me the yield. the same thing, but it is done much more sophisticated fashion in these models, including neural network, is to say, look, if you just do interpolation, you'll not exactly precisely get the point at which you'll get the best result. So what you actually do is you do a little more complicated mathematical function of this output as a function of these inputs, so that it can find out a much better optimal solution. Okay, so that is all we are trying to say. In very simple, if I look at this data and then you can even do simplex optimization kind of thing, and let's say in this region the yield is better, so I am going to pick an input. So a more sophisticated version is what these can do. And once you build a neural network model, the reversing is actually straightforward. You actually put the neural network model into an optimization structure and then re-ask the question. So given an input, I'm getting I want to maximize this output. How do I maximize find the input such that it is maximized? Again, the same neural network model can be used. So there are lots of work which has done this. If there is interest, I can send again papers. So Sarika, one thing is, anyone who has a question, specific papers and so on, they can write to me and I can send them later.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah,
thank you, ma'am. Please give me another chance.
Yeah, no more question right now. Let others ask the question, and if we have time left, I'll come back to you. So Dr. Ashish Lele, Ashish, you go ahead and ask the question.
Thank you, Sarika. Raghu, absolutely fabulous talk. Quick question, maybe a quick answer from you. So how do you guys define human intuition, and is there an ML equivalent of the human intuition? We use that all the time when we do research in our labs and offices. And how do you get AI to or ML to think about human intuition?
So human intuition, there are two things, right? So one, so I'll tell you how ML we will do this, but human intuition basically means you have seen data, and then from this data some pattern you have figured out, and that pattern tells you that maybe if I do this, something else will happen, right? So I actually believe if it is not a leap of insight, which is totally outside this data, this intuition can quite easily come from a machine learning model, because it's using all the data and looking at all kinds of possible complicated models which we cannot do. So I think that's one point I would like to make. The other point is the human intuition in ML is, even in reinforcement learning and so on, whenever learning occurs, there are two steps that go hand in hand. One is called exploitation, which is whatever model you already have, you exploit that model to figure out whatever intuition or hypothesize and check what happens. The other one is what is called exploration, where you actually just do some random things, just like how evolution occurs. So when you do this exploration combined with exploitation, you get insights which we call as intuition. So that is where the novelty finding is there. In fact, I had another video in my talk, which unfortunately I didn't have the time to do, about a bipedal walker. And you can see when you force that bipedal walker to really look for novelty, which is what we call as intuition, newer things, it really figures out something fascinating, which if you are within the framework of an objective and doing it, doesn't happen. So that's how this happens.
Okay, so the next question is from Dr. Mukta Gadgil. Mukta, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi Raghu. Thanks for that great talk. I was just wondering if, so you have machine learning algorithms with, like you're saying, a huge, parameter space, and that doesn't seem to cause it a problem. And whether cross-validation or the concept of cross-validation, which is not that popular in our regular modeling approaches. Especially, and I come from a biology sort of angle to this, where you have complex models with huge number of parameters that many times will then fail to predict because they are overfitting. And whether you think our normal modeling will do well to learn from, or learn meaning not learn, but implement the idea of cross-validation that comes from ML. Of course, there is probably dearth of data, which is that's a separate story. But if there is,
I absolutely think so. And so, for example, the way ultimately the correct model is figured out is using one of the well-known techniques is what is called k-fold validation, right? So what you do is if you have 100 data points and you break them into 5 groups of 20, basically you build a model on 80 and test on 20, and then build a model on the other 80, test on the other 20 left out, and so on. So this k-fold validation is a very well-known technique, and whenever we figure out errors, we always figure out errors only on data that is not seen by the algorithm. I think those are practices definitely that should be implemented in any first principles modeling that we do. But as you mentioned, a lot of this work great if you have tons of data, but if you are working at 5 or 10 data points, then you simply have to. That's where I think I would rather rely on first principles model, because there is this whole wealth of knowledge that we are bringing in, and data is a very small portion.
Yeah, thanks.
You wanted to ask the question? Can you go ahead and ask?
So Raghu, I'm sorry I dropped off. I wonder whether some of your AI and ML algorithms could have predicted that would happen today.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so I apologize for that to you and also the audience. So my question is actually related to the impact of biological complexity on such algorithms, on developing such algorithms. So we all know that AI technologies and tools have played a key role in this pandemic, to respond to the pandemic in different ways, from accelerating, drug discovery to managing infrastructure and so on. So I would like to understand, as a person that has been working in this field for so many years, what do you foresee as some of the major challenges in applying, AI and ML techniques to issues such as, pandemic preparedness, that's on a broader scale, and also small things like understanding mechanistic bases in biology?
So, interesting question. I think the challenges so I can kind of talk about technology challenges, but technology challenges I've already talked about. So you have to have a much bigger computational infrastructure that we really think about. We have to be able to integrate data from different sources into one repository. So all of this should be available for researchers. Right now, most of the things happen in silos, and in the previous question also, lower amount of data, less amount of compute power, you're not going to do as much as doing it together. So that's one. But I didn't have the time to touch on this, but there is another very important thing which worries me a lot, is about fairness and ethics in AI. Okay, and there is a whole host of issues. It will take one lecture to just describe to you what craziness AI, completely believing in AI techniques and algorithms and implementing it on public policy can do. And there is a wonderful book, Math by Distraction, I think. And that book tells you case study after case study where how the human biases are put into these AI systems, and later people think an AI system is unbiased because it's a computer. But the builder's bias already exists. So there are really important questions that are, that I think are a lot more relevant. And I think India is starting to think about ethics and fairness in these AI algorithms, because believe it or not, we are going to have these algorithms making a decision in our lifetime. These algorithms are going to make a decision about something that is of importance to us, and we would like to be treated fairly, and that should be true for everyone, right? So that's one thing that really worries me as we go forward.
Sure. So we know whom to invite once again for a talk.
No.
Thank you, Raghu.
So there are 2 more questions on the chat box, which I'll read out, and then I'll take the day to ask my last question. I was the first to raise my hand, but I'm going to ask the question at the end. So Dr. Rahul Bhagat, what if analysis 100% right? Sometimes things try to give best results. I don't know what exactly this question means. Maybe we can move. Can you read it, Raghu? Does it make sense to you?
So which question is this? Whose question? Rahul.
Rahul Bhagat.
No, what if analysis will not be 100% right? Not at all. In fact, this reminds me of another lecture I gave, and at the end of it, one of the audience member got up and said, if everything is modeled so beautifully using AI, will we all lose interest in life because there will be no uncertainty? Then I answered that question saying, look, even if we made a model which is 100% correct, okay, there is something called chaos. Minor difference in initial conditions with the deterministic model, a simplest deterministic model will give you a result which will be so different that you will not know that's a simple deterministic model, correct deterministic model that gave you this. So I told that lady that you don't have to worry about excitement in your life, it will exist as long as you are ready to take. Okay, so there is no 100% right. So I don't think we need to worry about it.
Okay, so the next is from Shikha. How to factor in stochastic events in ML, especially when we are trying to do microfluidic based design.
Yeah. So all our simulation setups are actually simulation setups under uncertainty. So for every one of these, whether the design parameters or the inlet spacing, we have uncertainty, and our designs have to work under uncertainty. That's how we take stochastic into account.
So okay, so I will then ask the last question, maybe because we are almost half an hour into question answer session. We should have kept it longer, probably, looking at the response, because of your amazing talk. So in AI, you have this hyperplane created with multiple vectors, right? And I guess the question is something related to what Ashish talked about, intuition, and what Mugdha talked about, checking. That let's say if I take a cricket match and I want to predict who is going to score, to make sure that machine learning is not giving me absolutely wrong results, and also learning it from machine learning would be probably to do a principal component analysis, see like if it is the score rate, something which is the first most important thing which is predicting it, and then also learning in the vector space the ones which are contributing, probably which wouldn't come in a regular intuition, but learning it, picking it up as an intuition and say that, okay, the way in which we are putting in the bowlers, that will also make a difference in the, the sequence of the bowlers will make a difference in the output of the match. So I guess that is, I just wanted your comment on this, it should be a combination of learning back from the machine, not only the final answer, but also in that case that in the vector space, which are the ones which we never thought of intuitively as a probable factor to control the outcome from there, right?
Yeah, so there are multiple questions rolled into this. So I'm going to kind of parse it and answer each one of this. So one is first, how do you make sure it does not give you some totally crazy answer? So in all of these techniques, we include a way to say whether the prediction and the data are totally novel. So the algorithm, you can write the algorithm in such a way that, look, this prediction is far out. And actually, because it's a kind of a mathematical model, though not easily something you cannot write down, but still a mathematical model, you can do analysis to say whether you are actually going out of the limb and whether this input data point itself is something you have not seen. So whether it's a novelty in terms of input data point, you can say, and whether it's a novel prediction also you can say. Okay, so in which case then the human has to come in and then say, do I believe this system enough to take a decision based on this? That's the human in the loop yet. Okay, so that is one. The other question you talked about, whether we can learn and then do hypotheses and do experiments, and that is where the AI researcher is all going towards. How do you learn from this and then hypothesize, do more experiments and learn from it? That loop, can I do it automatically? And that's the whole notion of this AI researcher work that is going on. And I think right now we can do this. My point is, I think we should be doing it now as much as possible, and slowly start building systems that will do this much better and so on. So that's the answer.
Thank you for an amazing talk, and I think we could have gone ahead for much longer periods with question answer session, but given that we have a fixed time, I will ask Dr. Swati Chatta to start this opening of the book ceremony. Swati Chatta, over to you.
धन्यवाद डॉक्टर सारिका। आज के कार्यक्रम के प्रमुख अतिथि माननीय डॉक्टर रघु जी, हमारे निदेशक माननीय डॉक्टर लेले सर, माननीय प्रोफेसर नांगिया जी, माननीय डॉक्टर पाल रत्न स्वामी जी और उपस्थित आप सभी सम्मानित जनों को मेरा सादर अभिवंदन। और जैसा कि आप जानते हैं कि हमारा CSIR विज्ञान और तकनीक के कार्यों से जुड़ा है। नित नए अनुसंधान और तकनीकी कार्य हमारे यहाँ होते रहते हैं। वही हम केंद्र सरकार के अंतर्गत कार्यरत हैं, इसलिए राजभाषा हिंदी में कार्य करना हमारा कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है, संवैधानिक दायित्व है और इसलिए हमारा NCL इस जिम्मेदारी को बहुत बखूबी निभा रहा है। राजभाषा कार्यों के अंतर्गत हम अपनी सभी प्रकार की साइंटिफिक रिपोर्ट्स, सभी वेबसाइट, टेंडर, एड, सभी डॉक्यूमेंट्स हिंदी में भी करते हैं और इन्हीं राजभाषा संबंधित कार्यों में एक महत्वपूर्ण कार्य है हमारी मैगजीन NCL आलोक, जो 6 मंथली रूप से प्रकाशित की जाती है। मैं माननीय डॉक्टर विज्ञान और प्रौद्योगिकी मंत्री माननीय डॉक्टर जितेंद्र सिंह, हमारे DG आदरणीय डॉक्टर मांडे सर, जॉइंट सेक्रेटरी माननीय डॉक्टर KR वैदी सरन जी, इन सबको बहुत धन्यवाद देती हूँ। इन्होंने अपने अमूल्य संदेश भेजकर हमारी पत्रिका की गरिमा को बढ़ाया है और साथ ही हमारे निदेशक माननीय डॉक्टर लेले सर को भी बहुत धन्यवाद देती हूँ, जिनके मार्गदर्शन में यह पत्रिका बन रही है। साथ ही इस पत्रिका में अपना रचनात्मक योगदान देने वाले सभी वैज्ञानिकों को, सभी स्टाफ सदस्य और स्टूडेंट्स को भी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद देती हूँ, जिनकी वजह से यह पत्रिका बन पाई। अब मैं आज के कार्यक्रम के मुख्य अतिथि माननीय डॉक्टर रघु जी से निवेदन करूंगी कि कृपया हमारी इस पत्रिका का विमोचन करें।
So, what do I do?
I think you have to say that I am doing it. Inaugurating the.
I'm very pleased to inaugurate this magazine.
Thank you.
धन्यवाद सर, सभी को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Dr. Swati Chatha. Can I request all the our chief guest and all the other dignitaries to switch on the videos for a snapshot of the meeting? Once a snapshot is taken, please let us know so that we can.
Nikhilesh, have you captured?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. Thank you.
So then finally we come to the last, but maybe one of the most important parts that I would like to thank everyone. So as part of NCL named lecture committee, me and my colleagues would like to sincerely thank our chief guest, Professor Raghu Rangaswamy, for gracing this occasion and delivering this amazing talk. You know, like I think we would have gone on and on with discussion. I think we would want you to come back in future and have a longer session, which is not confined to 1 hour, and we can have much more longer discussion session. I would like to thank our director, Dr. Ashish Lele, for his continued support. Thanks also to all the former directors. I can see many of them have joined this session for their continued interest, like Dr. Paul Ratnaswamy, Dr. Shivram, Dr. Ashwini Nangia, for joining and having an interest in what is happening in NCL. And then last but not the least, I would like to thank Dr. Mr. Sunil Patel, who is the event organizer, coordinator, and his management team. You know, Dr. Nikhilesh Yadav, Ms. Sonali, Mr. Balaji, Mr. Mani, Mr. Punjal, Mr. Devtoli, Mr. Asper, Mr. Shani, and Mr. Ronaki. Without their support, it wouldn't have been possible to have this session without any hitch. You know, we have gone ahead without missing, like, you know, we could utilize the time completely. And then, last but not the least, I would like to thank you all for your presence here today to make it a success. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raghu. Absolutely
Thank you.
phenomenal.
Thank
Need
you.
to have
you,
much
bro.
longer interactions there. Some point of time.
Will do. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.